So good morning, everybody. I'm Liz David-Barrett. I'm the director of the Centre for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex, as I'm sure actually everybody on the call knows. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. We are going to have a discussion about the role of anti-corruption agencies with a view to thinking about whether having a single anti-corruption agency might be an interesting option in the UK, really in a very exploratory manner, but because there have been some calls for having such an agency in the last few months, and there are also some opportunities in that the Committee on Standards in Public Life is currently reviewing the standards landscape in the UK, and hence there is an opportunity to enter a debate and discuss how we might actually change the system in the UK. We have some fantastic speakers with us today, so I'm going to give you a little indication of who everybody is, and then we're going to hear from each of them individually. So we'll have 5 to 7 minute introductory remarks from each of our speakers, and then we'll open up to a discussion. And this is an invitation-only event. We are keen to have a pretty frank discussion, although I should tell everyone that we are also recording the discussion, and we hope to do something with it in terms of circulating a transcript and entering that into the debate afterwards. So just to introduce the speakers, we have, first up, we're going to hear from my colleague, Professor Robert Barrington. Robert is the Professor of Anti-Corruption Practice at Sussex, but previously, of course, the Executive Director of Transparency International UK. So has been working on anti-corruption in the UK for, I think, about 15 years. Next, we're going to hear from Luis de Sousa. Luis is a professor at the University of Lisbon, and he has also been working on anti-corruption for many years, and in particular wrote a quite seminal piece about anti-corruption agencies and what the conditions are for their success and full operation. Next, we're going to hear from Francois Valerian. Francois is also coming from an academic background. He's a professor of finance, regulation and governance, but he's also someone who has been heavily involved in Transparency International France, elected to the board originally in 2013, and has led a number of business integrity initiatives at the Transparency International Secretariat, and in fact initiated TI's advocacy at the G20 around financial regulation and anti-corruption. And Francois is going to talk about the recent experience of France in setting up an anti-corruption agency. Next, we're going to hear from Professor AJ Brown. AJ leads the Centre for Governance and Public Policy at Griffith University in Australia and their anti-corruption research programme. He's also been working on anti-corruption for a number of years and also been a board member of Transparency International Australia since 2010. He's also currently on TI's global board. And AJ is going to talk about the current plans and proposals around setting up an ethics commission in Australia, which has been, I think, quite controversial. And then finally, we're going to hear from Dr. Sue Hawley. Sue is the Executive Director of Spotlight on Corruption, a fantastic UK NGO, which is doing really important work around holding the UK government to account in how it's actually implementing and enforcing its anti-corruption laws in all kinds of areas, from Bribery Act to, to issues around ethics and public standards. Sorry, excuse me. So without further ado, let's move on and hear initially from Robert.
Thank you, Liz, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk about the governance of corruption, which is a subject I've been looking at, particularly in the UK context over the last year or so. And inherent in that is two key questions. The first is who's in charge? Who's in charge in the UK of ensuring that the UK's anti-corruption approach is fit for purpose? I'll come to the answers in a minute, but these are the questions first. Who is in charge? And the second one is how effective is the UK's anti-corruption approach? And when I'm talking about anti-corruption approaches in the UK context, I mean, obviously domestic corruption, that's everything from prisons and police to borders, local government, social housing. So the full gamut of domestic corruption, including, of course, corruption in UK politics. Money laundering, the laundering of the proceeds of corruption through the UK, principally from overseas jurisdictions. But also public integrity. And clearly there's a dividing line somewhere which we can't easily discern between issues of public integrity and corruption. But certainly as we experience lots of criticism of the current government on issues around standards in public life, that question about when that tips over into corruption and who oversees that and is in charge is important. And all those things, domestic corruption, laundering the proceeds, public integrity, are added, of course, to the traditional issue of overseas bribery, which has probably had a disproportionate attention in the UK context due to the UK Bribery Act in terms of the UK's national response to corruption. So what are my answers? Well, the answer to number one, who's in charge, is we just don't know. I've looked probably more intensively at this than most other people, and it's really pretty hard to tell. Ultimately, it seems to be the Prime Minister. But one can't see that he's devoting a lot of attention to this issue. But he, at the moment, seems to be the person who's in charge of the UK's anti-corruption response. And the second question, how effective is the UK's approach? I think generally I'm not alone in thinking that the UK's approach is pretty patchy to be favourable to it. Those who criticise it would say it's remarkably ineffective. And there is a number of areas of evidence for that. Generally, this is ascribed not necessarily to deliberate negligence, but just a sense of complacency that the UK thinks corruption is something that happens overseas. We couldn't possibly be corrupt ourselves. There might be the odd rotten apple in the barrel, but the barrel overall is pretty sound. But for those of us who study the subject in a bit more depth, I think there is increasingly a question about whether there are some problems with other apples in the barrel, and indeed the barrel itself is a safe container. So overall, I think one can conclude that the UK's approach to corruption is very ad hoc. We've got an organic development of multiple agencies and laws over a number of years. And if you look at the Sousa principles, which we'll hear about shortly, the 6 principles for key features and principles for what makes an effective anti-corruption agency, I don't think the UK fulfills any one of those 6 principles in its current approach to tackling corruption. But what's interesting is that the UK does take a very concerted, coordinated, independent, durable, research-based approach to some other areas of national challenge. And I use the environment as an example, where there is a fairly concerted effort on environmental governance. And indeed a standalone agency set up to deal with these kind of issues in the environmental sphere. So I guess the interesting question that faces us in the UK is if the UK's anti-corruption approach doesn't currently tick any of the boxes in the 6 Sousa principles, what kind of approach might we take that does tick those 6 boxes? And that is, I think, what we're here to discuss today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Robert, for setting the scene. So, Luis, what are these 6 principles? Over to you.
Thanks, Liz. I'll probably start to give a quick overlook of what went on in the world of ACAs in the last 3 decades. We've had, at least since the 90s, and then there was a big push after the signing of the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption, a push for specialization in the field of corruption control. I mean, international standards have converged regarding the need to increment specialization both in the preventive and repressive areas, and that has placed the option of setting up these type of agencies right in the middle of this discussion. So we've witnessed, despite all the criticisms on the performance of these agencies, we've witnessed an parallel mushrooming of anti-corruption agencies since then. And that because there's been a confluence of efforts, intentions, and expectations from different actors. There's been increased support of anti-corruption agencies, although not always consistent, by multilateral and bilateral donors. There's also a fast-growing industry, anti-corruption industry that loves this kind of solution, because obviously it's an appealing consultancy product. There's been public opinion pressure also for visible results in the domain of fight against corruption. So, I mean, setting up this kind of agencies thus stir up the public debate and inflates expectations. Unfortunately, some of them will feel frustrated after a while. Others will be a little bit more calmed down from the results that are achieved by these agencies. And also there's been increased political interest in either obtaining or restoring reputation gains. And this is particularly important for countries with high public debt exposure. I mean, a country's perceived capacity to handle corruption, to fight corruption, is one among several political risk factors that are nowadays evaluated by risk agencies to evaluate the country's capacity to borrow money from international markets or its capacity to attract investment. So I think governments are pretty aware now that evaluations from Greco, from the OECD, etc., they can seriously damage the country's reputation. So, I mean, this is a way also of responding to that concern. Now, I mean, despite all this, and as I said, the criticisms on the performance of these agencies, and the fact that there's been quite the tendency for copy-pasting models from one country to another. I mean, we often praise the outcomes, but we completely ignore the context that allow for a certain agency to be effective in a given context. And that's been an issue. I think DiMaggio and Powell's seminal work is fantastic to interpret this tendency for adopting anti-corruption agents in the past 3 decades. Now, the world of anti-corruption agents, it's a tutti frutti, really. I mean, you have specialized body with multiple competences, such as the New South Wales ICAC or the Latvian CNAB, with both preventive and pre-investigative or administrative investigative powers with a wide spectrum of activities. Then you have specialized units within existing law enforcement or prosecutorial bodies, such as the Croatian USKOK or the Romanian DNA. And then you have specialized bodies with exclusively preventive competences, such as for instance, the Portuguese Corruption Prevention Council. Now, these categories obviously are neither exhaustive nor exclusive. Some of these agencies have also seen their statutes being abrogated in recent years from a strictly preventive role to having some investigative capacity or pre-investigative capacity. Whether the competences or the powers that are allocated to these agencies have been used to the extent, to the full extent this is also a matter of dispute, and I think there's a very interesting ground for future research there, because one thing is what is formally attributed to these agencies, and then the capacity, the resources, and the context to implement those competences. And this takes us to the 6 features or principles that I've discussed before, that in a way need to be taken into consideration when we are thinking about putting in place an anti-corruption agency. I mean, the first issue is the independence, and it has been a key issue in the design of anti-corruption agencies, and it's a continuous concern even during their lifetime. So most of the statutory discussions during the institutional design period, as well during the revisions of the competences of these agencies, evolves around this issue of independence from political interference. This does not mean that the agency that is completely loose. Obviously, it has to report, it has external control, but we're talking about the capacity, the operational autonomy, I mean, the capacity to carry out its mission without political interference. The other issue is, which links to this one, is the fact they're not created in a institutional vacuum. So they're adding up to an already existing integrity structure, which often is disformal, dysfunctional, and they have to interact with all these entities, or at least some of them. So it is extremely important to think this interinstitutional cooperation and for instance, if you allocate the competence of overseeing asset declarations to this agency, then you need to make sure that they can access tax declarations or property registers. And that is not thought in advance. So these agencies are put in place, and then once they're carrying out their work, they discover they cannot do it. That's why I was saying some of the competences are not used to the full extent, because once they want to put them into practice, it's impossible. So they are part of this integrity system. They share with many other public bodies some of its competence, and this needs to be taken into consideration during the institutional design. Another important issue is recruitment and specialization. Not to mention that some of these bodies are very small, so the chairperson is determinant. The chairperson is determinant in a small organization. You put a gray guy there, and that's it. It goes nowhere. You put a dynamic person, you might achieve some results. It really is. Recruitment and specialization go together, and this is also important because of what I just said, that sometimes anti-corruption agencies are seen as a solution to conventional bodies that are not performing well, and the immediate question is, where are you going to recruit your staff from? I mean, most of them are transferred from precisely the very same institutions that you criticize that are not performing well. There's only very special cases where recruitment is done at the international level, etc. But I mean, that's not very common, also because there's a language issue. That could be the case for some agencies in the Anglo-Saxon world, because English is quite spoken worldwide, but it's not practical for other agencies. So the inadequacy of recruitment and also training procedures is one of the major causes of lack of specialization of these bodies. The other thing is the goodness of fit between, or in terms of the goals, the mission and goals that you set for the agency, and of course, I mean, all the resources that you need to take careful consideration of this relationship, because otherwise you're asking the world from these agencies, but you're giving them very little to work with, both in terms of staff, in terms of material resources, and budget. And if you're expected to bring new input to corruption control and innovative research-based input to corruption control, resources are important. One of the main reasons for setting up these new specialized bodies, as it's mentioned in the United Nations Convention, is the need to address corruption in a knowledge-based manner. So you need to carry out significant research about the causes, the mechanisms, the effects, the impacts of corruption in order to improve policy responses. I think the last issue, which is not minor, it's the issue of durability. I mean, the decision to set up an agency is often the easiest part. To be able to guarantee its effectiveness and long-term durability, it's the Achilles heel. We've had experiences in the past. I mean, the context obviously now it's a little bit different, but for instance, Portugal is one of the countries that set this type of agencies even before the United Nations Convention, even before everybody was thinking that it was good to have a specialized agency. And I'm talking about at the European context, because we already had some examples outside Europe. But in the European context in the 80s, nobody was talking about setting up anti-corruption agencies. And we did this in the context of 2 austerity programs. Again, the pressure of international donors and the need to bring some, I mean, the perception of control in the Portuguese administration to a reasonable level. So they decided to create an high authority against corruption in 1982. And it was a military guy that was in charge of this. And, you know, it stood for a couple of years, but with no staff, little competences. So they reviewed the statutes in 1986, and they were then given some staff, budget, and they could even carry out some investigations, not just regarding public officials, but also elective officials. And then the trouble started. And in 1992, the parliament decides to extinguish this body with quite a consensual parliamentary vote. And the valuation that was done about this agency, the achievements, the shortcomings, it was impressionistic. I mean, it was not evidence-based. It was anecdotal. So, I mean, that's also another issue. People react to scandals. In the context of scandal, it seems a very good idea, you know, to score some reputational gains, but then they seem to forget these bodies. Again, I'm not saying that now in the current context it would be easy to repeat the same the extinction that happened in 1992 to the Portuguese High Authority in the current context would be politically would be very complicated. But you can kill it in so many different ways: cutting the budget, understaffing, you know, giving no visibility to this body. I mean, this is pretty much what's happening to the Portuguese Corruption Prevention Bureau. Okay, so I think I would stay there unless you want me to afterwards to come back and discuss a few considerations about the UK case. I think for now
Thanks very much, Luis. I think a good reminder that this is not something to be embarked upon lightly. Francois, we've been looking a lot to France from the UK and interested in how this anti-corruption agency has been set up, particularly given how politically difficult it can be to get this kind of thing going. Could you tell us about what's been happening in France?
Sure, Liz. Thank you. So, Liz, in your introductory words, you mentioned this project of having a single anti-corruption agency in the UK. And then Robert talked about the organic development of institutions and laws in the UK and the difficulty to find someone in charge of the UK's anti-corruption response to, the public response to corruption. And so to start with those concepts of having a single public response, it is clear that the French anti-corruption agency is not at all the single public response to corruption in France. So as you surely know, the concept of an independent authority is not a concept which is deeply rooted in French public history, political history, or even constitutional or public law. In France, traditionally, we considered that there was a sovereignty that was expressed by the elections and represented by parliament, government, president of the republic, so that there was no clear room for independent public administrative authorities or independent public bodies. Still, there have been a number of independent authorities that have been created over the last 20 years, mainly to regulate some sectors like telecommunications, electricity, and we've had since 2016, 2017, what was called a French anti-corruption agency, or the French anti-corruption agency, so the AFA, Agence Française Anticorruption. But this agency, even if arguably it more or less complies with some of the principles that Louise described, has a very narrow scope, or a fairly narrow scope. We can debate the scope, but I think that the scope is very important for an anti-corruption agency. In that case, if we do a bit of French recent anti-corruption history, the turning point has been the Cahuzac case in 2012, 2013. So for those who never heard of Mr. Cahuzac, Mr. Cahuzac has been a benefactor of the French anti-corruption fight. He was a very corrupt French finance minister. He resigned in 2013 after it was revealed that he had 10 million euros on a Singapore bank account recently transferred from a Swiss account. He denied having that in front of the parliament, and then it was proved that he had that. So a few years and a few smaller scandals later, we had the creation of this agency whose role is to promote anti-corruption prevention. So the AFA, the Agence Française Anticorruption, does not investigate or prosecute corruption. It promotes the prevention of corruption, which is provided for by a very important anti-corruption law, which is the Sapin law, which was passed in 2016. And that was this law which created this agency. So this agency has two missions, which are one, to help private and public organizations to have their own anti-corruption prevention systems, and also to control adequate prevention, because a number of organizations are now forced by law to adopt anti-corruption programs. So the AFA, so the French Anti-Corruption Agency, controls companies with more than 500 employees and a turnover of more than 100 million euros, as well as public institutions. It has the power to sanction the private companies, but not the public institutions. And those companies have to respect 8 obligations that are being imposed by the Sapin law, among them the elaboration of a code of conduct, creation of risk mark, the evaluation of the supply chain, number of things that, for example, we as TI have been asking for years now. And in the event of failure to implement these obligations, the director of the EIFA may issue a warning or refer the case to the EIFA's independent sanctions committee. A few words on the director of this agency. The director is a magistrate who is being appointed for 6 years, non-renewable, by the President of the Republic. Still, the EIFA is not an independent administrative authority. We now have the status of independent administrative authority in France, with its, for example, the ability to file legal complaints against people, against institutions. It is not the case of this agency. So it's more an administration which is being managed or led by someone appointed by the President of the Republic for 6 years, non-renewable. So what about the sanctions committee? So the sanctions committee may ask the company to adapt its internal prevention procedures and also impose pecuniary sanctions of below 200,000 euros for individuals and 1 million euros for legal entities. So that's on prevention and sanction. And the EIFA also monitors judiciary decisions relative to preventive measures. So there may be judiciary decisions that are imposing on companies to adopt preventive measures, anti-corruption programs, and it may also be part of a settlement. So it's another things like the independent authorities that France has imported in the last years from what we call in France Anglo-Saxon countries, which are the settlements, the judiciary settlements. So it's now possible under French law that the public prosecutor enters into an agreement with an entity implicated or indicted for corruption. And under this settlement, we are ending the judiciary proceedings, and the convicted party has to pay a fine to indemnify victims, but also to implement a compliance program for a maximum period of 3 years under the EIFA's monitoring. So the agency also has to monitor implementation of these programs and has to report to the public prosecutor on this implementation. For example, the EIFA is currently tasked with monitoring the Airbus compliance program after the settlement that was concluding with the French authority, among others. So there were also the British authorities, as you all know, that were involved. So since the creation of the EIFA, there were 125 controls or reviews that were carried out. So approximately 30 per year, 2/3 on private sector, 1/3 on public sector. There were also, in the context of these controls, 300 reports that were sent to the agency. So reports that were signaling corruption facts. And 9 of them were considered as containing information useful to authorities, investigative or judiciary authorities, and sent to them. The sanctions committee, so the performance has been slightly disappointing because there were only 2 decisions made since 2017, so only 2. One of them, they did not follow the EIFA's requests. And in the other one, the company was simply required to update its code of ethics. To carry out its missions, the EIFA has 57 employees, so that was the small size that Robert mentioned at the beginning, but it's linked to the narrow scope also. And in conclusion, I would put, and I was very interested in Luis's principles, and in particular in the interaction between the anti-corruption agency and other public bodies. And I think that the AIFA is interacting fairly well with other public bodies, but more importantly, it is not the only public structure which has been set to combat corruption. So we also have, I would say, arguably more important public bodies, like the High Authority for the Transparency of Public Life, Haute Autorité pour la Transparence de la Vie Publique, which was also created in the aftermath of the Cahuzac case. And this authority, its mission concerns the public sector with the reception and the partial publication of the declarations of interest and assets of a number of elected persons or lobbyists, and also the verification of newly appointed ministers' tax declarations. And lastly, the most important institution is the Financial Prosecutor's Office, so the Parquet National Financier, which was also created in the aftermath of the Cahuzac case. That's the reason why I was saying that Cahuzac has been a benefactor of our fight. And this Financial Prosecutor's Office is the investigative and prosecuting authority in corruption affairs. So it's the best known of those public bodies, the most powerful as well, although it suffers from restricted financial and human resources and is not independent from the government, which is the case. The only authority which is theoretically independent from the government is the Haute Autorité pour la Transparence de la Vie Publique, but I think we will discuss in our conversation, I hope so, what independence means, because if we were to have a more authoritarian government in France, and it's not to be ruled out, the government still has to appoint the head of these independent authorities. And at some point in time, those authorities may become less independent. So I think I will conclude or have an initial conclusion on those last words. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's fascinating to hear about, and also, great point that whatever system is set up, it needs to be robust to potential significant changes in how government works. Great. Let's go now to AJ to hear about Australia.
Thanks very much, Liz. I assume you can hear me okay, and a good evening to anybody on my side of the world. Good morning to most of you. Good day to anybody in between. And it's great to see some old friends, Paul and David, and Lewis, of course, who did his PhD in Australia. So we always keep Lewis as one of our own as well. I'll just try and cover a few key points about what's happening in Australia, hopefully in a way that is pretty relevant. And I'll probably make three main points, but the first really goes to that question, the same question that Francois started with about, is the perceived gap in the UK or anywhere for that matter, one that would require a single agency to come in and somehow magically be the silver bullet that solves everything, integrates everything, leads everything? And the answer to that is no, that's unlikely to ever be either the nature of the gap or the nature of the solution in most integrity systems. And in Australia, we can say that with some degree of confidence, because the situation in Australia at the moment is that we're undergoing at an advanced state of a debate about the creation of a federal, national Commonwealth Integrity Commission or National Integrity Commission. But that's at the tail end of a history where every single one of the 8 states or territories in Australia have had an independent anti-corruption agency for, in the case of New South Wales, Queensland and Western Australia, over 2 decades or 3 decades. So we have a lot of experience with anti-corruption agencies. Most of the state and territory ones meet Lewis's principles to a fairly high order. That doesn't mean they're free of controversy. If they weren't doing their job, they'd be free of controversy. But if they're doing their job, then they'll attract controversy. That's part of the definition. So, but what the debate we're now having is effectively a bit similar to the UK debate at a federal level, where because the federal government's considered itself to be so wonderful, it doesn't have corruption like the states or territories, and therefore it's never needed this same kind of artillery, if you like. that myth is now well and truly in history. Nobody believes that anymore, and most people never believed it. And the main reason for that is the same reason why the states and territories, one by one, have picked up an anti-corruption agency. And that's basically because it was recognised that the traditional law enforcement institutions could not do the job. Why couldn't they do the job? One is because they are traditional law enforcement institutions and therefore not inquisitorial of their nature. Their job isn't to find the truth and expose it as much as to prosecute, find and prosecute criminal offences. But and that's really the battle over the proposed federal National Anti-Corruption Commission in Australia, because although most of what's proposed for it after a long period of time should meet most of those principles quite well on most scores, the fundamental question of scope means that the proposal is that it basically be limited to being a law enforcement agency for the bulk of the public sector, including for parliamentarians, for the federal public sector. So you can tell by the way I'm talking, we're talking here about public sector focused integrity and anti-corruption agencies. Very little of this has anything to do with the private sector in the way that Francois was just talking about, or which is actually very, very relevant if you look at Hong Kong or Singapore and quite a number of other places. But we're basically talking about the fact that the state and territory anti-corruption are just limited to criminal law enforcement. They have of interest, grey area corruption, undue influence, misconduct, slippery slope misconduct, and sometimes that's criticised as being too broad. But the Federal Anti-Corruption Agency, it's very complicated, and you can read the detail. Because parliamentarians are so terrified about being exposed to that scrutiny themselves, they've ended up with a bifurcated proposed jurisdiction, which has some historical explanations that means that for about 80% of the federal public sector, including the parliamentary sector, then it would only be criminal offences that could be investigated, and not with the same level of transparency and openness that would apply to the other 20% of the federal public sector, and is the norm now at a state and territory level in Australia. So for that federal agency, where it's a question of, if they don't fix those sort of fundamental problems of the scope and the transparency and the extent of the powers, then it's not worth having, because it basically doesn't add anything and will just be a bit of a sham, and give people the illusion that there's something new and different about the system when there isn't. If they do fix those things, it would be a very good step, for all the same reasons that the state and territory anti-corruption agencies have made a huge difference and basically proved to be a very good investment. But having said all of that about the current state of the federal situation here, some of which you can probably relate to some of the factors that might play out in the UK or in other developed countries. I wanted to emphasise that issue of coordination, interaction with other agencies, which is one of Lewis's principles, doesn't go away. That some of the people who have argued why we don't need a federal anti-corruption agency have said because we don't want or need a single lead agency in charge of everything. And they're correct. That's not what we need, and that's not what we will have if it goes through. That's not what the states and territories have. They have one actor who specialises in real corruption, who can do it better and broader and deeper than law enforcement agencies can, and can coordinate across the public sector better in how they do it to bring some transparency and consistency to corruption risk management and responses that otherwise tends to get swept under the carpet or whatever. So that's a sort of a snapshot of the federal situation, but on top of that, there are other issues that need to be addressed, which a new lead agency for federal public sector corruption could definitely help with. It can help with coordination across the Commonwealth, or across the national federal government, which we call the Commonwealth. It would hopefully trigger better coordination between the states and territories and the Commonwealth, but that's not guaranteed, but that's what it should do. So it needs to be an interactive player in a better understood system. Across the board, there's a few things that it would need to do and the states need to do which aren't currently being done, which is a much more structural, proactive approach to prevention, to corruption prevention, not just enforcement, investigation and enforcement. It's not guaranteed that it would have that brief, but that's the same with the states and territories. That's a general deficiency across the board, is the limitations in our concept of what corruption prevention really is. There's a lot of expectation that it should, but in fact it wouldn't deal with political integrity issues properly. We have a lot of, we have no caps on political campaign expenditure. We have, in some states we do, in most states we don't, at a federal level we don't. So we have a lot of political integrity weaknesses at the moment to do with campaign finance and also to do with truth in political communication. This agency wouldn't deal with those things. Some people think that it would, but it wouldn't, because we need other parts of the system, the Australian Electoral Commission, other reforms to pick up those gaps in the system. That doesn't change if we create a federal National Integrity Commission. Just means there's a new player in the game that might be able to indirectly help, but those other reforms are still needed. And I guess the overall challenge confronting all our integrity agencies is the difficulty of attacking all of those grey area corruption issues of access to influence, undue influence, involving interactions between the public sector and the private sector, the soft corruption, which is the beginning of the slippery slope or hides much deeper corruption, and which also then can have quite a lot of relationship to our international corruption risks, to foreign bribery, to money laundering, to doing, how business is done. A lot of those things are things that this agency should be able to have an impact on, and if its scope was broad enough, it could have it, and we're certainly advocating for that. But it becomes a policy coordination issue that involves lots of other agencies picking up their part of those issues as well. So that's more than enough of a summary, I suspect, to give you a flavour of what's happening in Australia, and more than happy to come back to any of those issues.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, AJ. And then finally, I'm going to hand over to Sue to talk about the UK again.
Hi, thanks so much. Candice said this is such an exciting discussion and so useful to have international perspective. So I'm really looking forward to the debate. I just thought I'd riff a little bit on Robert's introduction about the UK and try and say what its problems are. And essentially, it has a don't look, don't see approach to domestic corruption, which it contrasts kind of strongly. It does recognise that it plays a role in corruption elsewhere, but as Robert kind of hinted, there's generally not very much recognition that happens here. And so the key aspects of this don't look, don't see approach are as follows. There's no dedicated law enforcement agency to investigate domestic corruption. We've heard this again and again from law enforcement bodies. Tristram's paper for the University of Sussex picks it up very neatly, as does some academic work in the UK. And there's no resource for it. And we know enforcement follows the money. If there's no resource, it doesn't get done. And this is really important because we saw after the Serious Fraud Office was given the lead to tackle foreign bribery, it made a huge leap forward. The UK made a huge leap forward in enforcement, and it kind of created interagency competition, who's going to get this case first. So you have to kind of make someone a lead agency to get the other agencies to want to kind of engage in that competition and compete for resources. The second part of this strategy is the only focus in the UK's anti-corruption strategy is on what they call the insider threat: police corruption, prison corruption, border corruption. And the other side of that is there is no political will to address senior executive level, what AJ just called soft corruption, the kind of ethics and integrity framework in the UK. And that's despite we've had 2 international reviews, the UNCAC review and the Greco review, saying the UK needs to develop stronger independent mechanisms for regulating conflicts of interest, business appointments and ministerial interests. The fourth issue we have is we have an inadequate law for tackling corruption in public office in the UK. It's been described as outdated and unclear by the Law Commission, which has recommended a new corruption in public office offence. And finally, there is no reporting line for domestic corruption, despite a commitment to do this back in 2016. So there's no statistics gathered, no evidence gathered at all about the number of allegations or complaints. And we have had discussions with government about this, why haven't they done it? And often the answer has been that it's because corruption is so hard to define. I think they're worried about being absolutely inundated with a lot of people think they see corruption but don't necessarily have the evidence. So that's the kind of background to the current strategy in the UK about the don't look, don't see approach. There's been a spate of recent scandals which does provide theoretically an opportunity for reform. And just to say a little bit about those scandals, these scandals go to the top of government. They include a former and a current Prime Minister, and they've raised real constitutional questions. Should the Prime Minister be the final arbiter of ministerial ethics if the Prime Minister himself has ethical lapses? The second thing with these scandals is they don't appear to have imposed any electoral cost on the government. They haven't cut through, as pollsters put it. And that raises real challenges for people wanting reform. But what's also clear is that these scandals are not going to go away. So there are now 3 different inquiries into the current Prime Minister's behaviour, 7 into the Green Seal lobbying scandal. And this is coinciding with what Liz mentioned is a huge review by the government's think tank on ethics, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, into standards reform. And we're also seeing increasingly vocal noises from some of the regulators, like the Business Appointments Committee at COBA, who are saying, we've only got 4 people, and increasingly writing letters that highlight their lack of powers. So these scandals aren't going to go away, and there's going to be a constant drip feed as these reports come out, which could keep up the pressure for reform, but it could also enable the government to slightly pick and choose. There'll be too much noise in a way. They could get away with, batting them off. So I think the question then comes down to, what kind of reform can we expect, and what principles we want behind reform. So I should be upfront here that we at Spotlight on Corruption have been promoting the idea of an ethics and integrity commission. It's great to hear the experience from Australia, because we often cite that as a potential example. And this idea was picked up by the UK Labour Party, who said that they would establish an ethics commission with an anti-corruption commissioner on it, but there wasn't very much detail of what they meant and how this would work. It was very much a kind of campaign idea. And it's also not a new idea. It was actually recommended by a parliamentary committee several times, actually. So I just thought I'd quickly go over the key few principles we think that there needs to be behind reform, which would be really great to bounce ideas off with people on this call. So I think the top one is that we really do need to address accountability at a senior executive level. That's about consistency and impartiality and how ethics and corruption are addressed. It's about, tone from the top. Why should prison and police officers really obey the rules if they can see, ministers getting away with it? But I mean, it's fascinating hearing the French example, because I just wonder in the UK whether you would ever have a Sarkozy type trial in the UK. We know that, the police investigated allegations that of cash for honours, peerages being given for donations, and that investigation hit a brick wall. So I think there's a real issue around senior executive accountability and its relationship to the Constitution in the UK. The second principle is that we do think the scope needs to be broad. As AJ was mentioning in Australia, it can't just be about criminal, illegal behaviour. And it also needs to be quite regulatory. The criminal process is incredibly slow, it's expensive, it's fraught. So it can't just be about the criminal aspects of corruption, but those grey areas, the conflicts of interest, lobbying. But that doesn't mean we don't also need strengthened criminal aspects to it, like proper resource and a dedicated body that is tasked with tackling domestic corruption. So thirdly, something that's coming up again and again is this need to independently investigate and impose sanctions. We've seen a lot of frustration as these scandals arise with bodies like the Committee on Standards in Public Life, the Anti-Corruption Champion having no investigation powers. So the kind of question, who is meant to be doing this? And finally, we do need some form of consolidation of the existing arrangements. The UK has a huge patchwork, but without necessarily trying to merge it all into one. So I really appreciate the comments that people have been making about, it's how it fits with other institutions is as important as a new body itself. Who's playing what role. Exactly the point about campaign finance, arises here in the UK as well. We need a beefed up electoral commission that has stronger powers as well. It's not, having an ethics commission wouldn't be a substitute for doing that other political work. So that's broadly the kind of, I hope that's given a bit of a flavour of, how we see the kind of opportunities and the context in the UK. I mean, I think one of the issues will be around cost. How expensive is it to set up a new commission? You'd have to really justify the need if you're going to set something up that's new and expensive. I mean, we've seen this already with the Business Appointments Committee. As the person running that, Lord Pickles, said he's only got 4 people, he needs more resource, but he batted away any reform because he said, well, having 50 people would be very expensive. And you think, well, there could be a middle ground. You could have 12. It's not an either or, but I can see the idea of expense being used as something to bat away any suggestion that reform is really needed. And we do have to be careful with consolidation. I mean, we've seen in the enforcement field that consolidation of police forces tackling foreign bribery actually was pretty disastrous in terms of setting back prosecution of foreign bribery by police forces by a long time. They were all consolidated with the National Crime Agency, and we have yet to see a prosecution actually from the National Crime Agency in that sphere. So I think we have to be careful of consolidation as well. And I think we also have to be realistic and address this issue, like, how far can we get ambitious reform and how far do we try and get better results from what we've got. So we've seen already the government is going to try and do really as little as it can. We saw the Committee on Standards in Public Life recommending that the independent advisor on ministerial interest have power to initiate independent investigations, be able to publish its findings, and it tinkered with his terms of reference to look like it had done something, but essentially didn't give him any greater powers. So I think there are strategic questions in here as well about, what realistically, do we go for what's realistic, or do we go for what's right and is going to be effective? And so that's, I hope, a basis for some good discussion from all these excellent people on this call.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sue. Okay, so I'm aware that we have a huge amount of expertise in the room, as well as these great panelists. So I'm going to open up now, and can I ask you if you have a question or comment that you'd like to contribute, if you could use the Zoom function to raise your hand, or if for any reason that's not working for you, just put your name in the chat and I'll then come to you. We've got half an hour left, so I'd also ask you to be brief. So if you could quickly introduce yourself at the beginning and then ask your question. And I would like to take a group of questions. So can we have a few more hands up questions coming in? Okay, so I'm going to go first to David Bannister. David.
Okay. Hello all, I'm Dave Bannister with Article 19 and previously with chair of the UNCAC coalition. So I had more of a couple of points around both internationally and domestically. So one is I've gotten to meet a lot of anti-corruption commissions through the UN stuff, and I mean it's an interesting thing to meet with them, and sometimes they're very enthusiastic to meet with civil society, and sometimes they're not so enthusiastic to meet with civil society. And you can see the same domestically. Some countries they want to work with us, sometimes they don't. So that issue around sort of accountability and interaction with civil society, which is in the UNCAC convention, isn't always necessary, but that's, I think, an important principle to also think about. I know at the domestic level, Sue and I and a few others on this call go to the meet with JACU every so often, and it's all very friendly and happy, and it's all so nice, and let's go work together and all that, and then nothing much ever seems to happen after that. And then the other is around independence. So I've done a lot of work around freedom of information commissions and data protection commissions, and some around ombudsman also. And the issue around them is, how independent are they? How well are they able to act without, how much money do they have? How well are they able to act? And there, the accountability principle, I think, is very important. Because there's all sorts of data protection commissions that are now being actively sued by individuals who are saying you're not independent enough, you're not actually enforcing the law. And so I think, there's quite a bit there around that. It is interesting, though, that FOIA and data protection commissions tend to be pretty resilient. I can't think of too many places. I think Australia had a period where they didn't have one, or it got quite limited, but for the most part they've managed to survive. So they may or may not be useful, the UK Commission being an example of one that's not so helpful, but they do manage to survive the ups and downs of government for now over 30 years in the UK.
Thanks, Dave. Paul.
Thanks very much. I'm Paul Hayward from the University of Nottingham. And thank you also for a really interesting set of presentations, which raised a number of very relevant and valid points. I've got a couple of observations I want to make. Like most of what I say, they are statements of the bleeding obvious and banal. But nonetheless, I think one of the things I felt when listening to these presentations, although I think it was recognized by some of the speakers, there's always, there's a favored analogy when people talk about corruption, which is health and disease and so on. And there's a sense in which anti-corruption agencies were being, in a sense, sort of the equivalent of if corruption is the disease, anti-corruption agencies might be one way of kind of tackling that disease. So, in a sort of a medical sense, they treat the disease, but leave out of question or at least run the risk of leaving out of question the underlying or the underpinning reasons for those diseases coming into existence in the first place. So I guess what I'm saying is that this is just part of a much broader landscape which needs to be looked at, and you can't simply look at the issue of corruption. You've also got to look at, well, why is that corruption happening? So an anti-corruption agency might be quite useful for addressing some of the aspects of corruption, but it can only work if it's situated within a much broader frame of reference of other things that need to be put in place in order to be able to tackle why those corruption issues are taking place. And so it would be a bit, I guess, another analogy would be the Tony Blair one of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. So if there's an anti-corruption agency, it's got to be tough on corruption, but it's also got to be tough on the causes of corruption in the sense of understanding why that happens and understanding how, within the kind of broader framework of the constitutional structure of the UK as a whole, an anti-corruption agency fits within that broader structure and what other changes would need to be made. Because it's not just an anti-corruption agency that would do the job. It would be an anti-corruption agency in the context of a series of other reforms that would need to be put in place to allow it to be able to function properly. And so I think those other reforms need to be part of that debate, which so far they don't really seem to be as much as they should be. And following on from that, just a second point, just briefly, is I think one of the things we're learning as we do more and more research into what's effective in tackling corruption is there is no one answer. There's no one type of approach which works everywhere. Things that work very well in one place don't necessarily work in another place, and even in apparently quite contiguous types of settings. And so we shouldn't get trapped into thinking that because something has worked elsewhere, it would work here. You've got to understand context. Now, this was recognized by most of the speakers, but understanding that context is very important for being able to understand what might work and how it might work in the UK. So my slight concern is that if there's real traction behind an anti-corruption agency or an ethics commission or whatever it might be, no problem with it, but don't please let us run the risk of people saying, well, that's the answer, that's what we need, and once we've got it in place, then that's fixed it. Because without all of those much wider reforms that are needed, it's not going to have a chance of working on its own.
Thanks very much, Paul. Tristram has a question. Tristram.
Good morning, everybody. Just a little bit about me. My specialism is asset recovery from a law enforcement perspective. I had a career in the police at a senior level doing that. And then I've spent the last 10 years touring the globe, visiting anti-corruption agencies and other agencies to help them understand how to do asset recovery. So that's my background. And my question concerns the narrative about corruption, because the UK is just starting to discuss domestic corruption. We have no real criminal cases of domestic corruption. That's what my paper says. We have no prevention agency, we've got no enforcement agency, and there's no real narrative except about international corruption. Cameron himself raised the issue with this anti-corruption summit, and he was talking about, as he put it, fantastic corruption over there. So the narrative was all about international corruption, and we haven't really discussed in the UK our domestic issues, which seem to me to be quite great. My reason for being here is because I spent 10 years touring the globe, and every time I came back to the UK, the elements that prevented corruption in the UK were being systematically unpicked over the last 10 years. And we now have a situation where there is a little bit of talk about corruption in the UK, about domestic corruption. So my question to all of you is how did you raise the narrative of corruption in your countries? How did you get to the stage where you were seriously talking about forming an anti-corruption commission, forming prevention against corruption, and increasing the enforcement against criminal corruption? How did that narrative get to be talked about to the level where you actually formed agencies to try and solve the problem?
Great question. Thank you, Tristram. Shahzad.
Hi, thanks, Liz. My name is Shahzad Valerian. I'm in the Sussex Law Department and part of the Sussex Corruption Centre. So I have a question for Francois. First of all, thanks very much for all of the presentations. Fascinating. So Francois, you were talking about, part of your discussion was about the kind of equivalent of deferred prosecution agreements in the UK, which is also kind of was imported originally from the US. And also non-prosecution agreement as well that they have in the US. So I was wondering if in France the kind of the process or kind of the preference is that to go down the kind of DPAs, or as you say, CJIPs, is it some sort of mechanism or strategy for corruption prevention rather than the kind of the previous process that you had? But also, is there anything in relation to individuals, not just for corporations, any kind of initiatives to tackle individuals as well as the corporations or companies? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Shahzad. And I'm just going to throw in my own question. Robert asked at the beginning, or he pointed out that in the UK, it's not clear who's in charge on anti-corruption. And actually listening to the experiences of France and Australia, I wasn't sure if it's clear there either. So I just also wanted to ask, what speakers think in terms of, is it important to have someone who's in charge of anti-corruption? But I'm now going to come back to all of the speakers. I suggest we go in the same order as before. So Robert, I would come to you first. And just to say to everyone, we've got 15 minutes left. So this will probably be the last time I come back to you. And so if you could just think about keeping your comments to around about 3 minutes or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Given time is short, I'm, to everybody's annoyance, not going to try and answer any of those questions, but to make a final point. And the final point is, I think there are 4 options that face the UK at the moment. The first one is do nothing. Just leave everything as it is and hope it is fit for purpose and does the job and so on. The second one is to create some kind of anti-corruption agency or integrity commission along the lines we've been discussing today, with all the caveats everybody's put forward. But I think the third and fourth options are possibly more realistic and more interesting. So the third one is to create some kind of independent commissioner type role with a very small centralized staff, like the modern slavery commissioner. We can't explore that now, but that model exists, it's out there, and I think could be applied to the anti-corruption space. And the last one is to take what we've got at the moment, which is principally the Committee on Standards in Public Life and the anti-corruption champion role, and to try and beef them up and make them tick more of those boxes that the Sousa principles outline. So I think those are our 4 options. It needn't be do nothing, it needn't be an anti-corruption agency. We do have other options too.
Great, thank you very much, Robert. Luis.
Oh, so many interesting points. Let me start by saying, I think first we need to unpack the issues. I mean, we're putting everything together, political ethics, regulation and management, corruption in the public administration, corruption in the business sector and international trade, coordination issues, the governance structure of the anti-corruption policy, and you already have a lot of dispersion in some of these areas. I mean, there's been a recent study by the Committee on Standards in Public Life look at this dispersion of mechanisms and regulations in terms of standards in ethical standards in public life. You have this also this the same problems of dispersion in terms of coordination that Robert mentions in his two papers. So perhaps it's better to consider things separately, because there are good things in place. I'm sorry, I'm now going to give you the perspective as an outsider. You don't have organizations similar to the Committee on Standards in Public Life in most European countries. I mean, the amount of research they've produced in the past. I'm talking about the first report, the report on local government, the report on political financing. It's incredible. I mean, the amount of evidence, inviting experts from other countries to give evidence in parliamentary hearings. We don't have this in Portugal. You don't know how lucky you are in that sense. So, I mean, there are good things in place that need to be fine-tuned for sure. I mean, I share your concern about this decaying standards in political life, in public life in recent years. But there are some good ideas from the past that need to be probably restored, reinforced, fine-tuned before we even consider the possibility of setting a new body. Although coordination issues, it's also clear that there is some problems there that need to be taken into consideration. Now, I would suggest that you really think first on why, what for, and how to set up an ACA. And I would probably suggest that you carry out a feasibility study to inform the legislator about constraints and enablers. You need to gather substantive evidence from national and foreign experts, from practitioners, civil society organizations, academics working in the field. And I'm sure, I mean, looking at what has happened in the past, I mean, this process of revision of standards that is being conducted by the Committee on Standards in Public Life, I'm sure you can have a high quality and participative legislative process. And this is something that doesn't happen in other countries. Believe me, we have a lot of legislators saying, I know what the solution is, and I think the solution is this. And he never says why and where he took the idea from. And this is what we get in a lot of countries.
Okay, great points. Francois.
Mute myself. Okay. So yes, I will try to succinctly address the questions that I heard or read on the chat. On the DPAs or settlements or whatever words we are using, so I'm not an expert in that. But it's also on the individuals, not only on the institutions or corporations, and it's not on prevention, it's on concrete corruption cases. And I think that the two engines for that in France has been the slowness of the justice. Justice is very slow, is paralyzed, and also on the accused or involved entities side, the fear of the intervention of the US Department of Justice, because as everybody knows here, they have those anti-corruption laws which have an international reach. So there is this fear and a sort of urge to settle in France so that they can be prosecuted by other bodies or foreign bodies. Then would we have one person responsible? I think that in France, it wouldn't work. We are, I assume, like the UK, an old country, old state with a complex administration. If one person is designated as a responsible, this person won't be the person really in charge of everything. So it may not be a good idea. Now, what led us to a central commission, I'm using the word that I'm reading on the chat. Again, it's not a central commission. So it's really, so France found this fancy name of an anti-corruption agency and used it to qualify a new administration that was formed. Now it's true that we've improved in terms of the anti-corruption apparatus in France, and that was in the wake of the Cahuzac scandal, because what led us to make those progresses, that was the scandal. And the scandal, I would say, preceded and followed by civil society mobilization. We may mobilize civil society before scandals, identifying risk areas, but unfortunately, we are not being listened to until there is a scandal, which unfortunately proves that we are right. And then we need further civil society mobilization. But without scandals, without big things that make the opinion aware that we have to do some progress, and maybe it's more sensible to do that progress than to vote for populist parties or some other, interesting moves. So that's really the engine for us and for the progress that's been made with the Sapin law and the rest. Now, beyond the institutional names that we are using, I think that what matters is two things: adequately staff and finance the investigative and judiciary structures, and heavily sanction the top individuals. Recently, we had a former French president of the Republic who was sentenced to a suspended jail time. To me, it's more important than having an anti-corruption agency. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very interesting perspective. Amy has her hand up. Amy, do you want to make just a very quick point? We've still got two speakers to come to, but if you'd like to come in and just make your point.
If that's okay, I just want to apologise for not putting my hand up sooner. I couldn't find the correct button. I just wanted to kind of make a very brief point to say that I am one of the policy advisors working on the Standards Matter Review at the Committee on Standards in Public Life, and this has been a really fascinating discussion. But just one thing, really, a kind of call for evidence. And one of the things that we have looked at, I mean, we've looked at a lot of how we strengthen the current framework. Do the arrangements that we currently have need greater independence? Do they need to be put on a statutory footing, for instance? Those kinds of things. And part of the evidence that we've heard, has emphasised the extent to which the complexity of the standards arrangements in government and parliament already undermine public trust compliance. It's very complex, it's piecemeal, it's ad hoc, we don't quite know who's responsible for what. So this kind of idea of an integrity ethics commission is very interesting, and something that we've heard about, but we haven't heard concrete proposals really for how this actually might work in practice. So really, just if anyone has any kind of idea about how, what it is that we could actually recommend here, because I think as good as it sounds, we don't know exactly how that might work in practice, what the powers would be, what the legislative framework might be, and if we don't have that kind of evidence, we probably wouldn't be able to recommend something like that. So just to say, would be really interested to hear any kind of concrete proposals for how this might work in practice. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. That's actually really helpful and good to know that someone's listening.
Yes, so, I should have said I just couldn't get Zoom to work, but thank you.
Not at all. But yeah, a challenge for all of us, I think, to actually talk about what this would mean in practice. So now I'm going to go to AJ, and then we'll finish with Sue. AJ.
Yeah, so I think that little intervention is very useful in emphasising, I think, what Paul was saying, and Lewis as well, that it really needs a sort of a gap analysis, if you like, or a very clear identification of what the problems are within the system that need solution, and then what you would design to address those problems. And it might well be that a particular integrity commission might help solve some of those problems then. And I guess to answer the questions about the specific questions about the drivers in Australia, and then also who's in charge. The drivers in Australia are a bit similar to Francois' response in that scandal is always, critical. You've got to have scandals. You can't get anything without a scandal. Just look at what happened with the UK parliamentary expenses scandal, and we had equivalent ones that did result in reforms of different sorts, etc. But in Australia, I think it's a bit more complicated in that we had the experience of the states and territories, like I said, where corruption was quite manifest, and not all at the same time, but in different phases. It was quite clear that there was corruption, that the institutional response had to be triggered because it became quite manifest that the existing institutions weren't doing their job. They've sort of worked, they've then affirmed that corruption is always there at some level, even if it's under control. You need agencies like this to make sure that you know what level it's at and that it's under control, and keep playing whack-a-mole, if not more than that. So that, I think that changed the awareness at a federal level. Then at a federal level, there was still denial for a long time, and in many ways, two things have happened, I guess. One is that our biggest foreign bribery scandals, as you in the UK would be conscious of, involved government-owned entities. The Securrency and Note Printing Australia foreign bribery cases involved, they were Reserve Bank of Australia-owned companies. So that helped demonstrate that there seemed to be a pretty big integrity vacuum in the brain at a federal level, given that they were nationally owned entities that were engaging in foreign bribery. So that helped. But a large part of the narrative, I think, at a federal level in Australia is still about prevention, even though the machinery that's being proposed isn't really going to attack prevention properly. The narrative is, well, we should make sure that we're staying ahead of the game, and to make sure we're staying ahead of the game, then it's worth making the investment to provide the assurance that we've got the systems that, if it is there, we'll find it and we'll leap on it. And so it's whether you can replicate that or not anywhere else, I don't know, but that's been part of the dynamic as well as the scandals, but really not massive ones, the same scale as some other places. In terms of, otherwise it's just chipping away really. In terms of who's in charge, I think the key thing about that is that there's coordination and leadership in different areas. If you ask the who's in charge at a political level, and that's where the champion in the UK looks to me like it was really good. We'd love to have anything like that because it's so rare at a state level and especially at a federal level to see too much. There's a little bit of political leadership, but nothing like that. So I wouldn't jeopardize that. If you were going to create an independent commissioner, you would make it complement that, not replace that. I wouldn't try and bureaucratize what little political leadership sort of leverage you've got. I wouldn't try and bureaucratize that or you'll lose it completely. So I think you've got to distinguish between policy leadership and coordination and operational capacity to go in and do the job and lead by example. And I think there's a fair amount of coordination and a fair amount of at an operational level. I think the agencies all work together, and there could certainly be more coordination and therefore more leadership, but you don't need one agency that controls all of the others in order to create that. And I think the other thing that's worth emphasising is that redundancy is quite useful. So, I mean, having a multi-agency approach is quite useful because they do, agencies do put pressure on one another, like I think we said a little bit earlier, to some degree, so that if things are falling through the cracks in one place, they can well be picked up by other agencies, albeit in a different form. The Federal Auditor General has been doing a great job of picking up some of the slack at a federal level and sort of affirming the need for more reform by showing that there really is a problem, even when it's not really his job. So hopefully that answers some of those questions a little bit. But I also particularly liked David's point about civil society. I think that's a big, it's a big lesson for everybody that we talk a lot about social accountability and its importance, but we haven't really institutionalized it much yet at all. And that's certainly true of our institutions as well. And it's definitely worth thinking about.
That's great. Thanks very much, AJ. So we are at 11, but if people can stay with us for a few more minutes. Sue, over to you for the final word.
Yes, thank you so much. What a fascinating session. Very interesting to hear both Louise and AJ say, you know, treasure parts of what you've got. I think, you know, picking up on the comment Paul's just made in the comment box, I think one of our problems is we've got the scandals. We just haven't got a sense of people caring about them at the moment, and that might be for a host of different things. But reasons, you know, COVID, you know, Brexit, you know, it's about context, isn't it? But I think that, you know, that is important because unless we make people care, the politicians don't listen to bodies like the Committee on Standards in Public Life and implement what they're recommending, and they make some great recommendations. So I think that's our kind of challenge in the UK, is how do we translate, you know, what is good stuff out there into kind of concrete action on this kind of public integrity front. But I think it's a really important lesson for me that's come out of this, is that it isn't just about, it's not the silver bullet thing. You know, maybe a commission will help certain aspects of the problem, but it's how it fits in with all the other parts like enforcement and, you know, a champion doing the political level work. So that's an incredibly useful perspective, and why getting this international picture is invaluable. So thank you very, very much from us for those international inputs.
Thanks very much. A big thank you to everybody, to all the panelists for some fantastic, really interesting insights, and for thinking about our problem and tailoring them to our situation, and also brilliant interventions from the rest of the audience as well. So I think this has been a really good start to debating this in the UK, and definitely a discussion that we would like to continue over the coming months. So we'll close now, but thanks very much everybody for being here, and watch this space. We will be putting out more interventions to help this debate along.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you.